You know, John Lennon was once said, "We all want to save the world." Another great poet of the 1970s, Arlo Guthrie, said it a different way. It's okay to want to save the world, but first you've got to save yourself. And that's how I got involved in historic preservation. Ironically, architecture is one of the most fragile of all the arts. A building made of stone and steel is much less likely to survive than a poem, or a symphony, or a painting, or a book. I'm angry. American cities are all beginning to look the same. Cleveland looks like Birmingham. Houston looks like Pittsburgh. And corporate clutter have beaten the character out of so many of our cities. Our downtowns are choked with bland boxes that have no souls. It wasn't always this way. We now have our most popular buildings are duplicated in every city in America. Once, great architecture was the expected norm in our civilization. Beautiful buildings made American architecture at its zenith 100 years ago. Craftsmanship in a building represented the quality and character of the owner of that building. And the distinction and personality of our buildings added liveliness to our cities and neighborhoods and towns. Houses once all had porches, and neighborhoods had sidewalks. And before air conditioning encapsulated us in our automobiles and at our TV rooms, people sat on their porches, and they walked on their sidewalks, and they greeted their neighbors, and they actually communicated with one another because it was built into the architecture. Many of our great buildings from a century ago have been demolished. In fact, the vast majority of downtown buildings from 100 years ago are gone, taking with it much of the character and quality of our cities. Now, in 1971, I moved into Riverside, a beautiful old neighborhood in Jacksonville that had once been the architectural showplace of the wealthy and middle-class citizens. And by the 1950s, that neighborhood had begun to decline. By the 70s, it was threadbare, and many great old mansions like this one were being demolished and replaced by incongruous modern office buildings. I hate that. Beautiful homes replaced by businesses. Out with the old. That was my grandparents' house. And in with the new. This beautiful Georgian Revival mansion was replaced by this modern monstrosity. Meanwhile, smaller residential and middle-class homes were being demolished wantonly for the expansion of hospitals and schools and businesses. So, in 1974, a few of my neighbors and I were sitting on my front porch bemoaning the loss of these great old houses, and we decided to call a meeting to see if anyone was interested. We put up flyers around the neighborhood, and this auditorium where we had the meeting held 75 people. 150 people showed up. We were on to something. We suggested that everyone attending that meeting contribute 25 cents to help in our effort. And at the end of that meeting, we had a starting treasury of $32. Whoo! We had an organization on our hands. We named it Riverside-Avondale Preservation, and it has now become one of the largest neighborhood preservation organizations in the South. At the same time, we did not realize it for maybe a year or two that we were part of a national movement. In cities and towns across America, many old inner-city neighborhoods were beginning to decay at the same time due to interstate highways, suburban shopping malls, and urban sprawl-generated residential neighborhoods that were choking the life's blood out of these older neighborhoods. Now, meanwhile, some of us former hippies and newly minted yuppies we're moving back into these older neighborhoods, not just because of the value of these buildings having such large, spacious floor plans and very low prices, but also because of the nostalgia for those ornate mantels and the hardwood floors and the stained glass windows of our grandparents' homes. Now, we quickly realized that historic preservation had some very quirky politics, and it was quite a conundrum because it's very civic-minded and patriotic to save revered buildings in our landmark, a very conservative notion. And yet to give government the ability to come in and tell us what we can do with our property, even prevent us from tearing a house down, is a very liberal concept. And so historic preservation is made up of very strange political bedfellows, sometimes called hysterical preservation. And it certainly is a very conservative, liberal concept, a very radical concept in many ways. Now, one of the tools in historic preservation are historic preservation ordinances. I worked on ours here in Jacksonville for 15 years before we finally got it passed. Over 2,000 cities in America now have historic preservation ordinances where often unelected historic preservation commissions have the audacity and the power to tell people how they must preserve their historic homes. And that makes a lot of people kind of angry. I rather like that. So here is the radical, conservative, liberal concept in a nutshell. Every day I drive by this house, many of you may also, and I marvel at that beautiful door. Now, I don't own this house, and I don't own that door, but if the owner of that house should demolish it or ruin that door, I would have suffered a very considerable personal loss. The owner of this building is a transient caretaker of that building. Many owners have come before, and generations may come afterwards, but if any owner in that chain should ruin this magical work of art, then the people of the future would have been robbed of something very, very important. Now, there are many terms that we use in preservation and restoration that are often misunderstood, so let me just define a few of the terms for you now. Restoration means the exact and accurate taking back a building to the way it was in a very specific time period, whereas preservation refers to that where we maintain a building and respect its building fabric, but upgrade it to use modern conveniences like air conditioning and so forth. There's another thing called remodeling, where we still respect the original form of a building, but may make structural changes so that the building can be used in modern life or even take on a totally adaptive new reuse. The fourth term is the hardest one to define. In fact, it leaves me speechless. It's called remodeling. What are these people thinking? You know, the historic preservation movement has saved many of our nation's great treasures, but it's also made some mistakes of its own, which have really set back the movement, in my mind, quite a bit. The first is this doting on grand mansions like Tara from Gone with the Wind, while ignoring smaller houses like bungalows, which are often, in my mind, just as beautiful. There is this penchant for placing a premium on the pure architectural styles that you can name in the architectural manual, rather than paying much attention to those buildings that are eclectic, or sometimes exotic or eccentric, or even local vernacular buildings. In my way of thinking, a mongrel is often much more interesting than a purebred. We have oftentimes tried to save landmarks and save that big special building while ignoring the context in which that building exists. For example, this old house was torn down. It was modest. Nobody raised a whimper. And the people next door moved away. And the street became empty. There was no one left to care for the block. And the neighborhood started to die. There is also this silly idea that the coolest way to save an endangered building is to turn it into a museum. Museums don't make sense unless you have an enthusiastic millionaire who's willing to pay for it forever. And there's often used sentimentality as the main motivation for saving our city's buildings. But economics and very strong economic arguments can be made for preservation, and preservation must make economic sense. If you tear down a historic building, you've not only lost the historic value and the cultural value, but you've lost the materials it was made of and the energy that went into consuming it. Now, our society has this big penchant for recycling our household wastes. And yet, if you demolish an average 2,500 square foot American home, you have totally obliterated all the environmental and economic benefits you gave by recycling 1 million aluminum cans, a neighborhood's generations worth of recycling. And the thing that irks me the most about historic preservationists is they've totally failed to embrace good modern architecture and to argue against bad modern architecture. Preservationists sometimes are so busy looking in the past that they don't see that the future landmarks for the next generations to come are being designed and built today. And so it's very important to pay attention to that and to revere these buildings which provide these great qualities that will be preserved into the future. The National Register of Historic Places acknowledges only those buildings that are 50 years old or older. So it's going to come quite a shock to many preservationists to realize that ranch-style houses are now eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And those quirky buildings from the 1950s and 60s are now going to be considered historic. Collectively, these buildings are known as mid-century modern, and they're being demolished at an alarming and disastrous pace. You know, it's all a matter of perspective. It is difficult for us to make aesthetic judgments today of what is going to be significant tomorrow. I'll tell you a story. 100 years ago, in Jacksonville, this beautiful city hall was the pride of our city. It was built just after the Great Fire of 1901 with its beautiful copper dome. It was the pride of the city and the state of the art. And yet 50 years later, this building was passé and out of fashion, and so they tore it down and built a new ultra-modern building on this site, a library that was called the Hayden Burns Library. And it was the pride of the city, this new library, state-of-the-art, until 50 years later, in fact, just recently, there was a movement afoot to tear this building down because, frankly, it's slightly odd-looking. Fortunately, they didn't demolish it. But I dare say that 100 years from now, people will look at Jacksonville and revere this as one of our most proud historic landmarks, an icon of its time, just like the old city hall with its copper dome would have been had it not been demolished. Kind of makes you think, doesn't it? Architecture is the most public of all of our arts. These buildings are out there for us to see and to enjoy every day. They're not housed in a museum or a gallery or in a theater, but we get to interact with our buildings and our community and connects our community that way. If a building is beautiful, it uplifts our community. And buildings are visual works of art that connect us all. If you have a building like this in your city, it gives you a sense of place, a sense of importance. And it makes our town different from all those other towns. Now, there's a disturbing trend in modern architecture that wants to build a historic building. It's called modern classicism, wherein a modern building pastes historic building parts on the facade for some nostalgic sense and calls it grand. Not too many years ago, we had a mayor who went to Nashville to see this building you see on your screen, which is the Nashville Public Library. And he thought it was so sweet with this little Faco columns on the front that he vowed to hire that same architect to come to Jacksonville to build our public library, and he did. And so we got a Faco classical facade with its blatantly stupid little Faco columns pasted on the front. What is the meaning of this building? The same mayor had a hand in choosing the design for our new county courthouse. He must have been looking at the back of a nickel because they chose the design of Monticello on steroids. An ugly building is a scar that must be endured by all of us. And this building is not only ugly, it's big, and it's going to be there for 50 years. You cannot build a historic building. So if you're going to spend my taxpayer money and build a building in the name of my city, make it something wonderful that expresses the joy and grandeur and culture of not just now in our city, but what will be like in the future. You cannot build a historic building, so why not build a great modern building? It doesn't have to be as amazing as a Sydney Opera House, but on the other hand, why not? Why not? So let us learn these lessons from history. Let us preserve that which is beautiful and brilliant in our culture. Let us all continue to try to save the world, but first, let us save our own little part of it. Thank you very much.